She wondered what they would say. What would be their first exclamations? Or would there be a delay? That same old routine of random chatter, and then silence as every head turned her way, eyes wide. Then they would grab the nearest weapon. At that moment, everyone would make it up as they went. She didn't have a plan either, just an objective: rescue the hostage. The only real way to do that was to make the fort hers. The old stone complex wasn't exactly out of the way. A road passed right beside it, coming from around the base of a mountain and then descending into a valley, but not before connecting with the front of the fort. Well, it might have been the front at some point, but really, from where she was hiding, she saw all kinds of ways to get beyond the outer wall. She could pick a spot where it had crumbled to the ground, or just climb a formation of rocks and hop onto the top. The only way she could tell where the front entrance was supposed to be was where the lookout stations were standing. They weren't tall enough to be towers. The wooden ladders allowing passage to the top platforms looked as old as the fort. Any higher, and the whole rickety frame wouldn't be able to sustain itself. What gave her a slight pause, however, was what stood guard upon either station. If she were at a further distance, she would have mistaken them for people. Perhaps they were once. Now, all that was left of them were bones. But they were ready, equipped with ancient longbows and quivers strapped across their rib cages. Ever so slightly, they wobbled under a sudden gust of frigid air. She didn't bother ducking down when the closest one turned its skull her way. There was no light in its eyes, but there didn't need to be. Whatever held its frame together also allowed it to see just as well as anyone. Yet, she was blending with the tree she stood under, hiding behind its trunk. Her faded red hood matched the color of the leaves hanging just above her head. She leaned to the right, just enough to let one eye peer along the surface of the bark and see most of the fort. If she wanted to see the rest, she only had to lean to the left and peer from that side of the tree trunk. Her employer gave her a quick history lesson of this fort nestled into the rock face. The road that led here was meant to give travelers a shorter passage from one side of the mountains to the other. The country she was in today was once divided into two. These mountains were a natural border. This fort was a response to bandits discovering a way to smuggle weapons from one country to the other. A patrol post now long abandoned since one side lost and was absorbed into the other. With the loser at her back, she knew she didn't have to look over her shoulder. This route up here was a sore subject, but mostly forgotten, which made it ideal for a group of mages to hole up here. A dark abode for those who practice the dark arts. She wasn't afraid, though. She was just trying to decide how she wanted to go about this. The best way would be to sneak in. She could probably exercise self-control, but then again, walking straight up to the front might make it fun. A wide smile stretched across her face, and she sidestepped from out behind the tree trunk. The long cloak that hung down from her hood flapped and swept back onto her back, wrapping around her body once again. Like a small, flickering flame, she moved over onto the old path of scattered cobblestones and strolled toward the fort. The animated skeletons didn't notice her at first. They were looking in the opposite direction. She didn't bother calling out to them. It would have been their fault for how much distance she closed between her and the two wooden lookout stations before they decided to turn their heads back this way. Before they did, she glanced to the left, catching a full glimpse of the fort. For the most part, the structure was hidden behind the surrounding wall, but she got to see the second and third floors fortified against the face of the mountain on that side of the route. The guy she had to rescue was kept in the lower level. Rolling her eyes back to the wooden lookout stations, she slowed to a stop. The skeleton guards had turned their heads at some point when she wasn't paying attention. Their vacant eye sockets were set upon the pale red of her hood and cloak. There was no sound from them. She doubted they were given voices along with their sight. They just pivoted their frames toward her, lifted their bony arms, and removed their longbows from their backs. Then they used their other arms to reach back and pull one of the old arrows from their quivers. The heads of those arrows were probably as dull and brittle as they were, but she knew it would hurt if struck by one. So she leaned forward and broke into a run down the road. Closing in on the two stations, she revealed her hands from underneath her cloak and held them out to her sides. Her fingers were splayed, but in her downturned palms swirled spheres of red light. Ahead and above, the two skeletons notched their arrows and were pulling the twine back, trying to steady their aim. They would try to shoot just ahead of her, hoping their arrows would arrive just as she closed in on that spot. Before they released the twine, she threw both hands forward, palms facing ahead. The red spheres of light flashed and then disappeared. A few yards out from the two stations, two large spheres of red light exploded into existence. Swelling out and spinning haphazardly, they lit up the space before the fort, blinding the two skeleton guards. Both spheres growled as they spun, burning the air around them. Their surfaces were transparent, but within each, something stirred. As these solid objects grew, the spheres became too small for them. The transparent surfaces expanded further with a hot gust, blowing themselves out. Left in their wakes were the solid shapes, now grown to their full height. She ran between them, her pace not slowing, and reached the base of either watch station. The two skeleton guards saw her, but just as they tried to rush to the edge of each platform and aim their arrows straight down, the two red humanoid shapes on the road lifted their right arms. In their upturned palms, they held growing bodies of fire. As soon as she passed through the two watch stations, the two humanoid creatures flung their arms downward, sending the bodies of flames racing toward the skeleton guards. The crackle and hiss of each projectile reached the interior of the fort's wall just as she did. Several pairs of eyes turned to see her arrive at the top of the hill where the entrance was. The space above the wall, now at her back, glowed just before the two flames smashed into the guard stations. Bright flashes shocked the eyes of those onlookers as the flames exploded, sending splinters, broken wooden beams, and shattered bones flying. She was running down the slope that would bring her to the base of the fort's main structure. Before she arrived, however, there were people standing about this open space. The mages. All frozen by what they just witnessed. The one nearest her just happened to avert their gaze, only to see a flash of blue before their eyes. She swept her right hand level with the mage's face, saw them flinch and start to spin backward, but she didn't bother watching them fall to the ground. She just targeted the next closest one and rushed in their direction. A blue mist trailed away from her right hand, but despite the weapon's transparent body, the handle in her grip felt as solid as iron. Her next target was much further away, almost standing next to the wall of the fort. They were all dressed the same, much like her, though their hoods were dark. Still, under the moonlight, she could tell when the mage looked her way. Maybe this one would have enough time to defend themselves. Whatever the case, she spared a moment to glance at the blade of her weapon. She knew she had connected with the first mage, but seeing the blood along the ghostly surface was enough confirmation. Right as she came upon her second target, she reminded herself that there was a third mage positioned near the front of the fort's main building. Whatever they were doing now, she had to prepare for it just as she was thrusting her ghostly blade forward. The mage before her swept their left hand outward. A sheet of light followed after. The tip of her blade struck the pale yellow flash, repelling its forward momentum. She was forced to dive to the left, passing to the side of the mage, whose arm was still outstretched. Having slid to a halt, she flicked her blade upward in the mage's direction. It was a gambling maneuver, But seeing as the yellow sheet existed for only a second, and the mage's chest was wide open, she went for it. There was a sense of resistance in her upward action. She heard the ripping of fabric, a gasp, and there was no retaliation against her. Ending her upward sweep, she had to sacrifice her balance. Now, facing the fallen mage, she fell backward onto the ground. The mage had dropped to their knees, jolted, and was now swaying to the left, revealing the third mage still standing near the front of the fort. She heard a woman's voice shouting as the mage thrusted their left hand forward. There was a white flash, and the air charged as several streaks danced their way across the open space. She knew what this was. Grabbing the edge of her cloak, she tugged it with her as she rolled to the left. Those streaks were upon her. The edge of her robe closed off her view of them, but she felt the impact. White light exploded against her, and she was pushed toward the fort wall. Crashing, she went into another roll, ending on her right side. Her feet and head had traded places, but she was just glad she was looking toward that third mage. Getting to her knees, she grabbed at both edges of her cloak and brought them together right after she saw another flash of white light explode from that mage's hand. The multiple streaks slammed against the front of her cloak, yanking her from her knees and slamming her into the wall. On her feet now, she slumped against the stone surface. Her arms were at her sides, but she had no grips on her cloak. The mage was thrusting their hand forward again. She grunted, pushing herself from the wall with her left hand and thrusting her right hand forward with a scoff. Another white flash exploded from the front of the fort's main structure. Multiple hot streaks raced across the yard. In her open palm was a pale white light. It expanded into a ghostly round surface just as those streaks reached her. When they met the ghostly body in her palm, she and the mage heard the sound of breaking glass. The streaks blinked and then fizzled out to tiny white embers. The ghostly light in her palm was gone. Since there was no impact from the streaks like before, she teetered forward, dropping to her knees. Across the way, the mage was looking down at their palms, hands trembling. Taking this opportunity, she extended her left hand. There was already a red sphere in her palm. It flashed and disappeared. Centered between her and the third mage, a much larger red sphere exploded into existence. The transparent surface spun while something solid grew inside it. The mage looked up just as the solid object grew too big for the sphere. The spinning surface swelled and flashed out of existence. The mage thrusted both hands forward just as the red humanoid creature achieved its upright posture. Both hands flashed white. The humanoid lifted its right arm, pointing its upturned palm skyward. White-hot streaks raced toward the creature. Some of them struck it in its abdomen and left leg. The strays raced toward her. She jerked the ends of her cloak forward, letting them graze along her sides and slam into the stone wall behind her. She stumbled backward from the twin impacts just as the red humanoid creature flung its arms downward, sending the body of fire in its palm forward. The mage cried out before the inevitable impact. The explosion spread in all directions, sending the mage's flaming body backwards. Fire snarled where the mage once stood, and then puffed out of existence. Silence followed. On the ground, she leaned forward, listening. Cloth sizzled, and the night air whispered. Remaining still, she then heard her own breathing. Her chest heaved in and out. Puffs of hot air escaped her parted lips and dispersed above her hood. There was something else. Several yards ahead, the existence of the humanoid creature heated the air around it. The red glow coming off its molten skin outshone the pyres standing about the area inside the fort's wall. The pulsing being hovered a few inches above the ground. Its back was to her. She knew its elemental eyes were aiming at its previous target, now deceased. Though its arms were angled away from its sides, its fingers outstretched but waving upon the air, as if always ready to summon a body of fire. She looked toward the entrance to the wall. A mound of slow-burning beams and planks of wood was blocking that way. She'd have to use one of the other gaps available. Before that, she tried to spot each of the mages she brought down. Remembering where they had been when she confronted them, she figured the lumps of mangled robes were them. As long as they didn't move, that was fine. Turning toward the base of the fort's main structure, the large wooden door remained shut. She snorted and chuckled to herself as she got to her feet. What? They didn't hear any of that? Letting her cloak slip back into place, hiding her body underneath, she strolled toward the large slab of stone extending from the front of the building. Without saying a word to it, the red humanoid creature turned, forgetting about its previous kill, and followed her. Stepping up onto the stone slab, she approached the large wooden door. There was an old rusted iron handle along the left side. She stopped, stared at the door, and then cast her gaze upward. Most of the windows had been boarded up, the glass having been long since shattered. She waited, watching them. Should a set of boards suddenly blow outward, raining not only broken pieces of wood, but some random type of curse down upon her head, she wanted to at least use that as a hint to there being others inside, and where they might be. Of course, as she lowered her gaze to focus on the door in front of her, she knew they could have been waiting just on the other side. A good way to find out would have been to let her humanoid aide blow the obstruction into pieces, but she grinned and extended her hand toward the iron handle. Feeling its cold surface in her grip, she sighed and jerked it toward her. The door broke away from the sill with a loud clank. Pausing once more, she waited. Nothing happened. There was no other sound from within. She snickered and pulled the door open all the way.